I'm Bill Craib, and I'm at my home in lovely Heartland, Vermont on the 4th of July. The editors of Baseball America magazine this week posted a thread on their Twitter feed. It had the simple request, tell us what minor league baseball means to you. Twice, I've been to every minor league park in the country in a single season. So the short answer is, it means a lot. This is the longer answer. This is Billings, Montana. It's a long way from anywhere in the world of Major League Baseball. The closest team is in Denver. On my 2003 Extra Innings tour, I happened to drive from Denver to Billings to see a game. It feels like every step of 555 miles, straight up Interstate 25. Still, there are probably more Rockies fans in Billings than fans of any other baseball team. Maybe. This is the hamlet of Elizabethton, Tennessee. It's tucked into the Blue Ridge Mountains and probably known for fishing and hiking more than baseball. And yet, it's only a 4-hour drive to Atlanta, so there are probably more Braves fans in Elizabethton than fans of other baseball teams. Maybe. But without any easy means of testing this, I would suggest that there are a disproportionate share of Cincinnati Reds fans in Billings, Montana, cheering for a team that's 1,500 miles away. I'd also guess that there are more Minnesota Twins fans in Elizabethton than would seem logical, given that the Twin Cities are more than 1,000 miles from the Tri-Cities of eastern Tennessee. Why? Because every year since 1974, almost 50 years, the Cincinnati Reds have sent many of their newest crop of rookies to play in Billings. Paul O'Neill, Todd Frazier, Austin Kearns, they all played in Billings at the beginning of their careers, where baseball memories begin, indeed. The same thing was true about the Twins and the tiny hamlet of Elizabethton, Tennessee. Minnesota has sent their players to lovely little Joe O'Brien Field to spend the summer every year since 1975, and Elizabethton has sent Ken Herbeck, Kirby Puckett, and Joe Mauer back on their way to greatness. But here's what's important to know about this. Choosing to become a Reds fan in Billings, Montana isn't usually a choice between becoming a Reds fan or a fan of some other team. It's a choice between being a baseball fan or not. What has looked inevitable for weeks finally became official this week. Minor League Baseball's 2020 season is over before it began. There will be no minor league baseball played in 160 towns across the country this year. I linked to 3 good stories about this news on the Low Mileage Tour site this week, but also pulled a quote from one of them that was on ESPN.com. The quote read, "When the minor league season ended last summer, business was good, perhaps as good as it had ever been. Most teams were profitable, with more than 40 million fans clicking the turnstiles of minor league parks across the nation. Now, we don't know what the landscape will look like when we next see affiliated baseball at the minor league level. We don't, in fact, know if we will be able to recognize that landscape at all." I fully intend to resume my Low Mileage Tour video series through the ballparks of 1991. In fact, my resolve to do so is even greater than it was before. I knew this news was coming, but it feels more personal now than it has. But given the historical impact of the first season without minor league baseball in 120 years, I wanted to take a couple of days to pause. I hope this video can explain why, to me, it seems really important, not just for minor league teams, not even only for baseball fans, but for American culture to try to preserve the minor league baseball landscape we've come to know in this country over the last century. Broadly, there are 2 reasons for the uncertainty surrounding minor league baseball's future. The first applies to many of us, and many other industries too. No one knows when the coronavirus pandemic will end, or even when it will begin to slow down, and thus the impact on our way of life is impossible to predict. The second reason, though, is to use a term from a course I teach frequently on workforce planning, much more driven by internal factors than external factors. No one knows what will happen with the coronavirus. That's an external variable. But we do know that the current operating system between major and minor league baseball is set to expire at the end of the 2020 season. In other words, before any more minor league baseball is played. We also know that one of the goals that Major League Baseball has expressed in negotiating a new operating agreement is a fairly radical restructuring of the way that future players are developed. First, this season, citing the coronavirus, the Major League clubs reduced the number of rounds in the amateur draft from 40 to 5. It seems likely that the draft will go back to something north of 5 rounds in the future, but the draft has been made progressively smaller over the last several decades, and Major League officials have asserted that the vast majority of talent it needs to, quote, support its business can be sourced in far fewer rounds. The Major League clubs would also then like to consolidate minor league operations. Having fewer players means needing fewer affiliated teams, and Major League clubs would like, when possible, to have those teams concentrated together to avoid longer bus trips, preferably somewhere near their home city. This would be quite a change from the far-flung small towns across the country that have made up the baseball landscape for the last century. Major League Baseball floated a proposal at the end of last year to sever parent club affiliations with 42 teams across the country as part of its next working relationship with Minor League Baseball. It raised hackles across the minor leagues for obvious reasons, but now the cancellation of the minor league season and the resulting lack of revenues for the year and a half between the end of the 2019 season and the start of the 2021 campaign, even if it starts on time, may mean that a number of teams won't make it financially anyway. The list of which teams would be cut and which would remain appears to be a moving target, but Baseball America magazine reported this spring that Minor League Baseball has become resigned to the fact that the number of affiliated teams will shrink to 120 next year. To lay this all at the feet of Major League Baseball would be unfair. When the two sides got into a public and acrimonious exchange of letters about the proposals earlier this year, the Major League Baseball response made some fair points. It's hard for the powers that be in minor league baseball to make a serious claim that they are in this to preserve baseball in small-town America, when minor league franchises have routinely and steadily abandoned small towns in favor of larger cities and even suburbs of major league cities over the last 30 years. The short-season New York Penn League is a case in point. When we did our trip in 1991, that league had 9 of its 14 teams in the rural towns of upstate New York. Today, there are just 3 left, and one of them was expected to be sold and moved even before this plan. Dan Hallam of Major League Baseball closes his letter by saying, "It's clear that this negotiation is not about minor league baseball trying to preserve baseball in small towns across America." Based on some of the points made in that letter, it's hard to argue with that. It would be equally hard, though, to assert that Major League Baseball is putting its best foot forward to do that either. It's been pretty clear about its motives for this restructured approach to minor league affiliations, and saving that relationship for small-town America seems to be pretty low on the list. But in the weeks and months ahead, it seems critical for the powers that be in baseball, both in the major and minor leagues, to do everything they can to change course. Because ironically, the biggest losers in all this may ultimately be the major league teams themselves, the sport they play, and even the fabric of American culture. Part of the rationale for the idea of contraction is that Major League Baseball doesn't need so many players in its farm system, and therefore doesn't need to field so many minor league teams. Former Dodgers and Mets catcher Mike Piazza, who hit 427 home runs in the major leagues and was a fan favorite on both coasts for many years, might disagree. He wasn't drafted in the first 5 rounds, or even the first 50. Piazza was drafted in the 62nd round in 1988, and would likely have never gotten to play in the minor league cities of Salem, Oregon, or Vero Beach, Florida, or Bakersfield, California, where we saw him hit a grand slam on our trip in 1991. Yes, by the way, that was Raul Mondesi hitting in front of Piazza in the Bakersfield lineup that day. He was drafted in the... wait for it. Actually, he was signed as an undrafted free agent. So was a pitcher on that team. Pedro Martinez also hadn't been drafted at all when he was signed to a free agent contract. Why all these free agent signings, even with 60-plus rounds of drafts? Because rosters in Great Falls and Salem, 2 teams that would no longer be around in this proposed landscape, had to be filled. Maybe Major League Baseball could have found Pedro and his 219 Major League career victories in one of the independent leagues, or in the Dream League it is proposing. But how would the Frontier League, for instance, which is in the business of entertainment, not baseball development, have ever found him? Or found another undrafted pitcher, Mariano Rivera, who we saw with the Greensboro Hornets during our trip in 1991. How many kids in Great Falls and Bakersfield and Albuquerque who would read in future game programs that Pedro played there, just like the players that were 20 feet away from them, went on to become baseball fans and pointed to their community with pride as the place where he got his start? How many in Greensboro and Albany and Fort Lauderdale and Columbus did the same thing with Mariano Rivera? Baseball, like no other sport, has a collective history. To the extent that it was or has ever been America's pastime, it is because it truly was played everywhere. But those everywheres were all connected through the intricate network of relationships that is the minor leagues. To this day, the town of Wilson, North Carolina, has a museum of baseball history. Among its prized artifacts are exhibits of players that played at the local ballpark, Fleming Stadium. This is a park that was last used for professional baseball for just a half season in 1991, the year of our excellent adventure. But there are exhibits in the museum today about Rod Carew, who played for the Wilson Tobbs in 1965, and about Robin Roberts and Ted Williams, who both played in the town during a spring exhibition game in the 50s. Across the South, residents of small towns still point with pride to stadiums where Babe Ruth or Hank Aaron once played. The value of the relationships between minor league baseball teams and the communities that host them are in these shared stories. They are what the writer Robert Putnam calls social capital, fraternity in its truest sense. I won't pretend this book, which was first published 20 years ago, is an easy read. It's not. But it makes some important points that are likely to become even more important to us in this country in the months and years ahead as we try to recover from one of the most tumultuous periods in U.S. history. You may have noticed that these videos are hosted on a site called Project to Find America, findamerica.org. Not to make a long story way longer, but I have come to believe that our country has been suffering from a severe lack of social capital for some time. Partisanship and polarization in politics, applications with the ironic name social media that seem to cause people to behave in very antisocial ways. There are lots of reasons for this. But at some level anyway, minor league baseball for most of its history has been an antidote, a contributor to social capital, in big cities like Las Vegas to be sure, but also in small towns like Pulaski, Virginia, and once Wilson, North Carolina. To a very large extent, though I don't think I could have articulated it this way at the time, it was the desire to find and hear these collective stories in Macon and Midland and Medicine Hat that caused me to want to do this trip to 178 ballparks in the same season, and it was also exactly the reason why we didn't bother to see any of the teams of the Gulf Coast League or the Arizona League that year. I don't have anything against those rookie leagues, which continue to operate to this day, and people would ask us sometimes why we didn't bother to see them. But they exist for the sole purpose of giving major league prospects a place to play against each other. There were few fans at the games, and no town names, just GCL Astros and Cardinals and Yankees, all wearing the exact same uniforms as their major league clubs. We knew we wouldn't find any stories there because there are no communities there to house them, and thus, no people to tell them. That was a map of the 55 communities that have lost affiliated baseball since our trip in 1991. There are dozens more from coast to coast that were once home to an affiliated team, but lost it before our excellent adventure took place. The major league clubs have argued that affiliations aren't necessary to make minor league baseball teams successful, but here's the thing. It's only when the relationship between communities and players come full circle, that its benefits to all baseball fans and the sport itself become clear. Without his stardom in Minnesota, Rod Carew's story would never have had value in Wilson, but without Wilson, he might never have played in Minnesota. In other words, a version of Rod Carew that played all of his minor league baseball at a complex in Florida probably would still have had an impact on the fans of the Twins in Minnesota. But for decades, Rod Carew retired 35 years ago. Fans in Wilson and Minneapolis have had this shared story, and it's been multiplied by the thousands of player-community relationships over baseball's long history in this country. Some folks point to two groups of leagues that have been quite successful at drawing fans in recent years as reasons why affiliations don't matter. There are independent teams like the Somerset Patriots and St. Paul Saints and Long Island Ducks. There are also the College Summer League teams, the Macon Bacon and the Wareham Gatemen and the Madison Mallards. What if these leagues are simply the future of minor league baseball, it seems reasonable to ask. What's wrong with that? While there is nothing at all wrong with these teams, they offer a lot of fun at a great price for the fans that go and have proven in multiple communities across the country that they can be very successful financially, at least before the coronavirus. But to compare the teams of the current American Association to teams of the Midwest League or teams of the Coastal Plain League with teams in the South Atlantic is to compare different things. Independent league teams, like those I just listed, can and often do sell lots of tickets. Independent teams in the traditional minor leagues, on the other hand, have a long and mostly checkered past. They, like the 1991 Reno Silver Sox, Salinas Spurs, and Bend Bucks, were bad on the field and worse at the gate. The 1991 Salt Lake Trappers, an independent club in the Pioneer League you'll meet later this summer, won the league championship that season and, playing in a city that would soon return to AAA, far outpaced the rest of its league in attendance. But their winning formula was executed by a promotion-savvy GM who was also able to sign a group of players that were talented but older than any of the other teams in the league, and not one of them ever played a game in the majors, few were even signed by major league clubs. Independent and summer leagues like to point out that a number of their alumnus have moved on to be signed by major league teams to play in the minors, but 100% of last year's rookie league Bristol Pirates had signed a similar major league contract. If the new normal of minor league baseball is to be teams that draw well and aim to win their local leagues against other nearby teams, the end result will be, in effect, smaller versions of the major leagues themselves. Relatively few people would remember that Loyola of Chicago had won the Missouri Valley Conference before going on to the NCAA basketball tournament 2 years ago, but many more would recall that the 11th seed went on to an improbable run and got all the way to the Final Four. It was the national context that gave their remarkable story meaning. Future wins in Binghamton and Boise will be worth something in relation to the other communities in their league, but there will be no connection to a larger national story. And when that's been true for long enough, and true in enough places, the major league teams will cease to matter much outside their own cities either, and baseball will be something far less than America's pastime. The analytically driven folks at Major League Baseball can probably point to very good data about how to run a more efficient and less expensive player development system by restructuring the minor leagues. But if they would shift the costs associated with the minor leagues from their player development line on the P&L and think of it as a marketing expense instead, they would have a much truer sense of what they were getting for the investment. I'm an optimist. Perhaps it's not too late to change course. Here are 3 things we could do in the weeks and months ahead to see if we can preserve minor league baseball as we've come to know it over the last 120 years. If you can, let's try to help keep teams afloat until 2021 by buying something from a small market minor league team. Whatever the talking points of the negotiation between major and minor league baseball may be, it's not hard to see that some clubs are going to struggle to survive until next spring. Most minor league revenue comes from ticket sales and sponsorships, neither one of which has been coming in 10 months, and now won't for another 8 at least. All the minor league clubs have online stores, maybe a new hat or a t-shirt, and extra credit for those that have the town name on them. Remember, it's all about the communities. Try to support other things that teams in those communities may be doing as a way to bring in some revenue. It could be advanced ticket sales or tickets for some other kinds of events, takeout food, Airbnbs, whatever. Let your local politicians know that keeping affiliated baseball in smaller towns is important to you. Maybe share a story of a player you remember seeing in their town, and feel free to let your favorite major league club and media know about those stories too. Oh, and one last thing.
Now the real purpose of this camera is to get everything on tape, is that right?
Yes. 29 years ago last night, Bill and Sue's excellent adventure was at lovely Riverside Stadium in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Yes, that's Baseball Tonight's Carl Ravitch as a local sportscaster in Harrisburg. Carl used our mic and his to simultaneously shoot an intro to the story he was doing about our trip for his station, and also for our video.
Video camera. Bill and Sue want to make sure they have everything on tape. That's the whole thing. Now, along with a secure running car, some money, and food, the other critical element to the success of this trip is a video camera. Bill and Sue want to make sure they have everything on tape.
Harrisburg has not been on any of the cut lists I've seen, but other teams in the same league have. Starting again on Monday, I'll be revisiting each of the stops we made on the excellent adventure, and maybe, if we can get the word out, it might help people see what's at risk if we lose affiliated baseball in America's smaller communities. Until then, my best wishes for a happy and safe 4th of July. See you next week.
Now that it's finally all over, if you had to come up with one final feeling or one final thought, what would it be?
Well, it was definitely an excellent adventure, and I can't wait until 50 or 60 years from now when I have grandchildren, and I can sit there and bring out the old scrapbook and say, look what your grandmother did. And they probably wouldn't believe me, but
I think that people everywhere said that we were living a dream for everybody, and I guess that was true, and certainly we got to live our dream.